Hey folks, this is a quick sped up edit of the third live sketch stream that I did in the series starting a few months ago. What we're doing right here is going through working with Z-spheres to build up an armature on a concept. And I was really just playing around with the shapes, trying a lot of different things out. If you slow down the video or you watch the full length video, you can pick up some of the settings and things I'm using. But for the sake of this clip, I just wanted to kind of give an overview of what's going on. So here I'm going through using mostly a clay buildup brush to shape things out, probably alternating between clay buildup and dam standard and the move brushes. And I'll use those to rough out shapes over a mesh that's been generated from that Z-sphere armature. So here I'm playing around with some of the forms, masses. I think I had this idea in mind for this guy that was like a two-legged, sort of obviously bent over. I was going for an almost cute reptilian sort of thing. And you'll see as the video goes on, eventually I abandon this kind of horizontal form altogether and go to a bipedal concept that in the end I feel like came out really nice. So along the way, there's a lot of playing around, a lot of pushing and pulling on forms. That's kind of part of the fun of doing a concept sculpt. You can see here, sometimes I'll literally just erase away all kinds of stuff and then come back in. Here I'm using mesh balloons to just rough in some different shapes and try out some different things. When you're concepting, it's just concept, and it is a lot of playing around, and you want to try out a lot of different shapes just to see what looks the most interesting and what kind of feels like an interesting, what's going to feel like an interesting creature. So once I start getting some basic forms roughed in that seem, like I said, interesting, but also kind of I try to make sure I have some balance, something that looks like I can develop some kind of plausible anatomy out of it. Once those kind of forms are built up, I'll go through and start drawing in different details and things across the piece, playing around, maybe try look right there with the nose and the mouth, kind of test out in advance some lines and things that I think will contribute to the design later on. So I think it was at this point that I decided to really focus on the eyes, which I'll usually shove a couple of spheres into something and then start pulling the mesh out around those, using those as a guide. Most often tucked inside another subtool. In this case, I actually pushed in mesh of the eyes, duplicated that into another subtool, and then used Dynamesh to combine that pushed in sphere with the sculpt that was there to give me this start for eyelids. It's a great quick start for eyelids, and I believe in the full length video I kind of talk about this method when I'm doing it. So if you go watch the full length video, you can get the full details on the methodology for that. At this point, I can see as I review this and do this voiceover, I can see that around here is where I started to allow myself the freedom of drifting into some of the more detailed ideas, playing around with what kind of details and things I would have in the end. A lot of times you'll draw these things out, or I'll draw these things out on a mesh at this stage and build up these ideas knowing that I'm probably going to erase them. But once I've kind of played around with it on the surface and sculpted it out just a little bit, kind of roughly, then it gives me an idea more clearly of where I'm headed. So later on, I'll still have a picture of that in my mind. I believe it's about to get to a point where I actually, here's where I start playing around with converting it to an actual bipedal little alien guy. And I pull some kind of crazy tricks with that if you watch the full length video, you'll get the methods for that. it's actually kind of neat seeing it sped up like this. So yeah, here I literally took his back half and just cut it off, flipped it 90 degrees, and then used some mesh balloons to shove in some volume there that I would go over. Yeah, the face that developed on the guy definitely led me to, like, as I looked at it, I was like, I don't want this bipedal. I don't want him, with his face close to the ground, or where he's, looking down or anything like that. I was just like, this little guy feels like he should be about, just over knee height, and just a, like a scrappy little pod person sort of thing walking around. So I think I paused for a second there, and the Zbrush screensaver came up. So yeah, I'm gonna jump back in here, and it looks like, this, I remember this part. This is where I started to edit the legs quite a bit, because the bipedal legs just didn't cut it. So you can see at this point, even though I've cut mesh from the previous shape of him bipedal, in the end I eventually dial all that back. Even though I use some methods to try and keep some of it, I still it's very strange, but I still allow myself the freedom to ditch it. And but it still served a purpose, though, because it was there to kind of guide my mind. And sometimes you find out what you need by doing what you don't need, and the creative process on this sort of thing becomes almost subtractive, where you do something and then you see it and think, well, that's definitely not what I need. So if that's not what I need, then how does that relate to what I do need? If I've landed in an area that I'm not happy with, well, what would be the opposite? Maybe the opposite of that would be something I'd be happier with. So here we're back to the clay buildup brush and building up the volumes on these hands. I absolutely love the mesh balloons combined with Dynamesh. It's a really neat way to be able to get volume into a concept super fast and in a very organic way. Roughing in some folds and things. Again, going back, just like before, when I drew in kind of some rough anatomy guides on what would have been the hunched over, almost quadrupedal version of this. Here, now that I've gone and flipped the design completely, I'm going through and building out some kind of anatomy guides and getting some of the markers for that sort of thing into that mesh. So here we just kind of reorient the little guy and pull him up in the scene. I think the new legs are coming soon. Let's see. So adding in some of the folds and flabbiness for the shoulders. I really like that stuff. On a character like this little guy felt to me like he should be kind of amphibious. Like his skin should be a little loose, which means it's going to have kind of almost a heavy cloth or rubber-like folding and creasing around different areas. As I work on something like this, I start to think of stories and think of, what kind of life has this guy had? What kind of environment does he come out of? And, if I were putting this character like on a screen, in film or animation or a game, what's his deal? And so being this sort of amphibious character who in my mind is probably out interacting with people in some way and, is out of his normal watery element. I like the idea that, you get some cracks in the skin, you get a little shriveling around like the lips and all that sort of thing. The big hunch to the back felt like a nice place to add these different lines across it, kind of roughing in some shape there that sort of builds outward, kind of inflates outward as a reflection of where his spine might be underneath there. So, ah, here's a fun part. It's always fun when you start working on their little butts. A tiny little butt on this guy, and I think I joked in the video about how he needed to have a cute little baby butt. So he's just a tiny little set of buttocks on the little guy. Here we go with the legs. We start adding in some volume for that. I thought about going with backbent legs, but frankly, I've done so many characters through the years that have digigrade legs that I was like, man, not on this guy. I want him simpler. Digigrade legs oftentimes to me evoke something. It doesn't have to, but in my mind, I think of digigrade legs on much more predatory sorts of characters, and this guy doesn't. I don't see him as predatory at all. I see him as kind of cute. So, lots of proportion work, playing around with the shapes, getting all that sort of in place. I think the feet should be coming relatively soon. Let's see. Okay, that's how I thought. I was thinking for a second about how I did the feet on here. So I figured I probably did a straight pull down on them and then start roughing the shape out. Some kinds of creatures I like to have feet and hands that are so similar that a lot of times I'll actually lift the hands off, kind of manipulate a copy of the hands, and then put them in where the feet are and use that as a start. It's a good way to jumpstart things, but on this little guy, I really wanted to keep heavier masses and folding of the flesh in mind down around those ankles. Oh, I remember thinking at the time, I was like, I want this guy to have little like iguana cankles. A few more folds. It's always tempting to do characters that have wrinkly skin. I feel like that's almost well, probably is kind of a thing among a lot of ZBrush users. I think there were some jokes for a little while, a few years ago, that I heard in some forums and things about it. About, oh, look, ZBrush creatures, look at all those folds. But there's something about working in ZBrush that actually just makes it fun to sit and sculpt those stinking folds. So I have to sort of discipline myself not to go too fold heavy on things sometimes. So just having some fun there with the hands. I feel like the hands were a good way to kind of humanize the little fella just a bit. Hands are an area that I can get into and spend far more time on than I really like. I'm very picky about the shape of hands on creatures. If it's even a remotely anthropomorphic character, I want hands to feel, even though they're fantasy creatures, the hands still need to feel believable and sort of quote unquote correct. So that if you pose it, you animate it, and you use the hands for expression, it looks right to the human eye. So a lot of times that actually means kind of dialing back from some of the more exotic sort of creature shapes and bringing it back towards something a little more humanoid. Here we go with the working out the fingernails. And the fingernails, I feel like, really humanize these hands quite a bit. And again, it's something that I really thought about in the design at this point, because I felt like the character had so much life to him already. I wanted to make him feel relatable. So when you take a creature design like this, that is obviously, you know, it's pretty far from anything remotely realistic. But then you can build in these very human little elements like fingernails, you know, joints that work certain ways, certain places, maybe have certain proportions. Um, there's lots of little cues you can pick up in the way the human form works and the way our eyes read it that you can then work back into a creature design and make for a more relatable character. Of course, as with anything else in this clip video, the techniques that you see there, if you'd like a deeper dive into those, please go check out the long form video. Post a link to that in the description below. So here's an example, like I was saying with the feet. Instead of clipping the entire hands and using those for the feet, this is a neat little trick where I'll clip usually the thumb. The thumbs make good toes. So I'll clip a copy of the thumb and then I'll go shove that into place on the foot mass. And then we'll just work all of that stuff out, the proportions of it. And it very consistently makes for very functional feet. I like the way that comes out quite a bit. And once you take that copy of the thumb and you end up stretching it and moving it around, working on the proportions of it and everything, it really does work out well for toes. So I think at that point I'm dynameshing it, and judging from the, if I remember correctly, when I was doing this particular moment of Dynamesh actually had me a little scared because it took a while. So this video sped up a lot, so it had to sit and really process on that. So here I believe I'll be removing some volume. Also, I like to work in Sculptress mode a lot, which is actually the first time I've seen Sculptress come up in this video. But it's a great way of working with your mesh, just in concepting, to like be able to essentially use smoothing to erase mesh. I think I did use it earlier in the video, but I didn't have the wireframes turned on so that you could see it quite clearly enough. Sculptress mode is in the last couple of versions of Zbrush. The introduction of Sculptress Pro into that is something that I've really enjoyed. It's kind of opened up the sculpting capability in Zbrush to feel even more natural, which is crazy because Zbrush has felt supernatural for so long to me anyway. But with Sculptress, it really expanded the capability of that quite a bit. So if I believe right through here, I ended up kind of spending a little extra time building up those flabby volumes around the feet and ankles. And at this point, that pretty much finishes the little guy. I think I'll probably go through here a bit and just touch up a few last minute pieces on it. Then, as I usually do in my morning sculpts, I'll do a turnaround, maybe a turntable, maybe even a nice render of him at the end. But that pretty much wraps up this little guy. I think I called him Torta. That was the name that I came up with for it. And not entirely sure what I'm going to do with this little guy yet, but I'm really thinking about eventually doing a nice topology on him, you know, finishing him out with nice topo and UVs, possibly turning him into something to release for Daz Studio, or maybe just making him into a little race of critters to use for the new efforts we have going on with miniatures, collectibles, things like that. I think this guy would be a fun piece to have posed, and have different outfits for him. I would love to take this little guy and have like some big gun backpack on him and some sci-fi stuff. So that's going to close this guy out. As always, remember, like, share, and subscribe. Go to 6s1.com for our newsletter and 6s1 Collectibles, where you can pick up resin prints or STLs of a lot of this stuff. Until next time, I'm Les Garner from 6s1. Thanks for watching.